Richard II was King of England from 1377 to 1399. He was the subject of one of Shakespeare's greatest plays. There's a scene in which Richard says this: "For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered from within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king, keeps death at his court, and there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp." Shakespeare wrote a lot about kings. Power was one of his major themes. This weekend we celebrate Christ the King. Pope Pius XI introduced this feast in 1925, and he introduced it because at the time he was very upset with the abuse of power that he experienced around him. Well, Shakespeare did not include Christ the King in any of his writings, probably because Christ's kingship is a paradox. He was not like any other kings. He was not born in a palace, but rather a stable. His crown was not gold, but thorns. He was certainly not a king in conventional terms. He turned the meaning of secular power upside down, and his power was a threat to worldly power. The very day that Richard II was deposed from his throne, he asks for a mirror, and he looks into it and he states, "O flattering glass, that dost beguile me, was this the face that like the sun did make beholders wink? Was this the face that faced so many follies, but was at last outfaced? A brittle glory shineth in this face, as brittle as the glory is the face." Richard came to realize how brittle his power was. And then he smashes the mirror on the ground because his reign is over. And at the end of the play, he sits as a prisoner in Pomfret Castle. And the man who grooms his horse tells him that the new king now rides his horse, the horse that Richard rode, and he rides it with pomp. And then Richard asks him, "Well, how's the horse carrying him?" And his groomsman responds, "It carries him proudly." And Richard II is crushed. He's forgotten. Shakespeare leaves us with a pathetic leader whose power destroyed him, because Richard II's leadership and power was the wrong kind. Jesus, paradoxically, hanging on a cross between two thieves, gives an example of real power and real leadership. And 2,000 years later, he is not forgotten. Not forgotten because, unlike so many kings, he did not use his power to dominate or manipulate or humiliate others. Jesus was totally powerless on the cross. And he is remembered because his power was all about service and humility. There was no place in his kingdom for violence, for retribution, for manipulation, or humiliation. The world hasn't changed much from the days of Jesus or the days of Shakespeare. Human beings grasp for power to control, dominate, manipulate one another. We see it in governments, we see it in the church, we see it in large corporations, just about every institution that exists. In today's world, certainly power is complicated. It can be used for good or for evil. And that's the tension that we will always face as human beings Because as human beings, we are tempted by that part of ourselves that is selfish and wants to use power for our own good. We all remember that famous quote from Lord Acton, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Well, certainly some people have a lot more power than others. They run countries and corporations. But as we gather this weekend, we cannot dismiss the power that each one of us has, the power that each one of us can use for good or for evil. Just think about the power of our words, our own words to humiliate and shame, that is happening daily in our schools with the amount of bullying that young people are going through, and young lives are being destroyed because of the bullying. Just think about the power of our prejudices. 2 miles from here, my own alma mater is making the national news all week long because of racist graffiti, and kids at the university are afraid to go to classes. Just think about the power of the written word that we all have available to us, wherein we can humiliate one another on Facebook, on Instagram, tweeting and spreading lies and rumors. Just think about the power of our anger when we use the silent treatment for revenge. Yes, all of us, each one of us, we have lots of power, for good or for evil. So as we gather on the feast of Christ the King, perhaps each one of us just needs to reflect on how we use our power. How do I use it as the rector here, as a priest? How do you use it as owners of business or parents, as a husband or a wife, as part of a family, as a classmate? Our power can be exceptionally destructive or exceptionally helpful, because we have the power of a kind word, the power of saying nothing when we want to be critical. We have the power of showing forgiveness. We have the power of being open to opinions that are different from our own. We have the power of dialogue and listening, and we have the power of giving second chances, and I could go on and on and on with the power that we have for good. So on the Feast of Christ the King, let us reflect on real power, the power to help one another and not abuse one another, the power to care for each other and not manipulate one another, the power to use for the good of others. Richard II abused his power, and at the end, even his horse deserted him. He looked into that mirror and he came to realize how brittle that power was, and it shone very clearly on his brittle face as he smashed that mirror into the ground. So perhaps on the Feast of Christ the King, it's an opportunity for all of us to prepare for the Advent season, which begins next weekend, those few short weeks to prepare us for Christmas, that maybe each one of us needs to put that mirror in front of our face and reflect upon our own power and how we use it for good or for evil. Do we realize how brittle power can be? And to go back to Shakespeare, for God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings ruined by their own use of power. Let us pray for the grace to use our power as Jesus did, in service and in humility.